Hi, how's it going? This is Resident of Collinwood, and I'm here to talk about the three Dark Shadows movies. Yep, all three of them. The 1970s movies with House of Dark Shadows and Night of Dark Shadows, and the 2012 Tim Burton Dark Shadows movie. You know, I love House of Dark Shadows. House of Dark Shadows, out of all three of these, is probably the best movie. Dark Shadows movie, in my opinion. And I want to stress this: when I do these videos, these are my opinions. Um, what was House of Dark Shadows? Now, to be fair, House of Dark Shadows was made in 1971 and released in 1971, obviously. So this was fresh with the series. Now, was it canoned with the series? No, but this was still, the series was basically over, and they decided to make these movies, and well, it was over actually, but these movies here were made because of the popularity of the show. I mean, there's no way around that. We can't sit here and say, even, well, I can't sit here and say, well, they weren't made for that reason. No, they were absolutely made for that reason. I mean, let's be honest. The series was popular. It had a huge cult following. It still does have a cult following. And so they decided to make a movie. And David Selby was actually making a Night of Dark Shadows as well with Dan Curtis. And Dan Curtis wanted to make House of Dark Shadows. He wanted to do the vampire. Now, what do I give? Is House of Dark Shadows the better movie, and why is it the better movie? Really, because, and this has been well documented, Night of Dark Shadows, there was a lot of stuff cut from it, and so really what you get out of Night of Dark Shadows is, I don't want to sit here and say an unfinished product, but it almost feels like an unfinished product, because when you watch Night of Dark Shadows and you compare it to what House of Dark Shadows is, House of Dark Shadows is definitely a finished product. Where Night of Dark Shadows, you feel like there's so much not there that they're not saying and not shown. And you can sense that when you watch the movie, really. That Night of Dark Shadows with David Selby as Quentin and Laura Parker as Angelique, that there's really a lot there that isn't in the film. It just feels that way from even the start of it, and throughout it, they're leaving little hints. And the movie was, about possession and time travel, really. And it sort of, even though it hints at that, they don't really show you time travel in a way, the way they did in the series. This isn't, the I Ching Wans or them, or even, Victoria Winters going back through seance, time travel through seance. Um, I'm trying to slow down, guys. Sorry, hold on a sec. It's an early morning. It's one of those mornings. But I do think when I look at House of Dark Shadows, what do I give House of Dark Shadows? Like, I give it a 7 out of 10. Okay, and here's why. Number one, let's look at what the story is. The story is caretaker Willie Loomis. Now, Willie Loomis isn't the thief he was. House of Dark Shadows is definitely an alternate version from the series. Again, it's not canon with the series. There's no, even though it has a lot of the cast from the series, you have Joan Bennett, you have Nancy Barrett, you have Kathleen Lee Scott, you have Jonathan Frid, John Carlin. You just have Thera David, you have Grayson Hall, sorry, but you have just a Lewis Edmonds, David Hensley. You just have so many of the original cast from the series in that movie. But in the same sense, it's not canon with those series. It's not, they're not picking up from where the series left off. You know, because when the series left off, Barnabas was cured. He wasn't a vampire anymore. And they ended it with parallel time, a parallel time episode. So, Dark Shadows, did it really get a goodbye episode? In my opinion, no. And you do this movie where Barnabas is a vampire somehow. No explanation, just again, this is why it's not, this is another reason this isn't canon. This is basically its own version. And not only does the movie suggest that with the way they're shooting this, but and the character and Willie in a sense too, but the words Barnabas says, Jonathan Fritz character says too in this movie is just so right at you. It's almost at the audience, I would dare say, as much as it is at Willie Loomis. And I need to get a stand for this since I don't have to hold it. But because it's hard to hold this with my hand. I apologize for switching around it. But House of Dark Shadows, they take a story from the series. Catherine Lee Scott's character, Maggie Evans, who's the governess, which she did become the governess later on in the series, way later. She wasn't the original governess, that was Victoria Winters. But Maggie Evans is the governess in the movie, and she's played by Catherine Lee Scott. And she's looking for David, and the storyline they're going to use is Maggie clearly looks like Josette. And for those who don't know, in the original series, when Josette's ghost first appeared out of the portrait, that was Catherine Lee Scott. Catherine Lee Scott was uncredited and unpaid for that. And it's something, you know, I give her a world of credit for playing that character. I've said that in my previous videos, and I'll say it here. That she really deserves a lot of credit for playing Josette's ghost in the series. And there are things that I find so interesting about that the fact that she was uncredited and unpaid is amazing. But in this, they don't show her as Josette's ghost. There's no any of that. They do not only take the story from the series of where he kidnapped her. Now that he doesn't kidnap her in this. In the series, Barnabas Collins kidnaps Maggie Evans because he looks like Josette. But instead of kidnapping her, and trying to force her / romance her to be Josette, he's flat out romancing her to be Josette. He's trying to, where in the series he was trying to steal her from Joe Haskell. In this, he's trying to steal her from Jeff Clark. Go figure. But, so there's that, you know, and again, I give them credit for what they were trying to do. The reason I give this a 7 is because they are taking a story from the series. They're not necessarily creating their own story in a way from that part. Where it's not created from... Now, they do alter it. I've said that. They don't kidnap Maggie in this. And when Maggie Evans is dressed as Josette, when she has that dress on, she is Josette. I mean, Catherine Lee Scott is absolutely stunning as Josette and as Maggie Evans. And when she wears that wedding dress, the Josette wedding dress, I'm sort of Barnabas. I don't call her Maggie no more. I call her Josette. And that's just the illusion of it. They do play off the series there from that standpoint, and they do a good job. But again, it's built upon what you knew in the series. It's built upon the story you followed in the series. So it's okay, how are they going to make this different? And here's where the difference lies. We don't hear the words, we don't hear Jonathan Fritz's character say, I was cursed by a witch. That never even gets mentioned in the movie. He says something so interesting, when they put this curse on me. So he says the word they. So I'm thinking, wait a second, who's they? Who put this curse on him? It's not Angelique anymore? And I will say that sort of hints that this is really an alternate reality of what we knew. That this story, while yes, they are taking from the series, there are differences, and you got to listen to the words of what Fred is saying. Fred even tells Willie, I used to be just like you. And when you watch the series, that's not necessarily the case. He was nothing like Willie Loomis. So what is he talking about here? This is really, in a lot of ways, while there's similarities to the series Barnabas, there are differences to this Barnabas that Fred is doing. Um, he is somewhat being sympathetic, but he's not being completely sympathetic. He bites Carolyn. He turns Carolyn. He, flat out kills her in this. Where in the series, and by the way, that's from the series as well. He doesn't kill Carolyn in the series. I want to stress that. In the series, he just turns Carolyn into a vampire. He doesn't even really turn Carolyn into a vampire so much as he puts her under his, spell or control. Um, so that's in the series that he puts her under her control. Now in the movie, he turns her into a full fledged vampire and kills her, or kills her. Then she rises from her coffin, and she bites Dawn Briscoe's character in this, and boom. Um, that's right. Dawn Briscoe's in this as well. So again, when you look at this movie, you do almost wish they would have canoned it with the series. You do sort of wish they would have done something a little bit different, a little bit else to sort of turn this into what it should have been, maybe a canon movie. But they didn't canon it, and that's could have, would have, should have. I don't look at House of Dark Shadows and go, I hate it. I enjoy it very much. Now, Night of Dark Shadows, do I give it a 7? No. If anything, I would dare say Night of Dark Shadows is more original than House of Dark Shadows. I do give this movie a more of an 8 because it's literally its own thing. They're not taking Quentin Collins and saying he's a goddamn werewolf. They are taking Quentin because he is familiar. Now, do they sort of do the same synopsis of, okay, you're familiar with Quentin from the series, so we're going to use him? Yes and no. Yes, to the point of you're familiar with the name, but I would dare say this isn't exactly the same Quentin Collins we saw even in the series. That David Selby is playing a completely different Quentin, almost. And I love how they did Daphne. I love how Laura Parker never gets enough. Me and John Philip Betancourt were talking about this, I think a couple of days ago. I know we talked last night. Laura Parker was so ahead of her time as Angelique the Witch. And not just in this movie, but in the series in general. She was just so ahead of her time, and she was so great. It's hard to not see Laura Parker, not hear Laura Parker when you think of Angelique. And that's credit to the actors. Say what you want about the writers and them writing the lines. She sold it, and she sold her ass off. Drinking some coffee, guys. And so Night of Dark Shadows, you have a bit of a possession slash time travel. Also, John Carlin and Nancy Barrett are in this as well, but they're not playing the same characters. Nancy Barrett isn't playing a Collins, which is interesting. So, and you have Garrison Hall in this, who James Storm is in this. There's just, I really appreciate Night of Dark Shadows more than what most do because it is really its own story in many ways. Where House of Dark Shadows sort of isn't in some ways, Night of Dark Shadows is. So I enjoy Night of Dark Shadows. Now, is Night of Dark Shadows canon with the series? No. Basically, they never canoned any of these movies with the series. And I do want to stress this, and I know this video is running long, so there's no short way of explaining this. There's no short way of talking about this shit, and there isn't. Apologize for the language. Um, and for the 2012 movie, now I do. Here's what I find interesting most about the 2012 movie. But this movie is made in 2012, but we don't set it in 2012. It's set in the 70s, 1970, what, two, I think he says. But it's so. That's what I was most shocked at, that they were setting this in the 70s when I first saw this. Because, again, it's not like they canoned the last two movies with the series. There was no, to me, there was almost no reason to set this movie in the 70s. Dark Shadows was long gone by this point. You know, the series had, there's no, while you can go watch the original series, it's not like the original series is airing in syndication anymore. I mean, maybe decades, but I do feel that them setting this in the 70s hurt their story. I feel the writer just setting it in the 70s wasn't great. Now, what is good about this movie, even though I don't like it? Eva Green and Michelle Pfeiffer's performance was amazing. Their chemistry was great. I love, if you watch this movie for no other reason, the 2012 Tim Burton Dark Shadows movie, watch it for Eva Green and Michelle Pfeiffer. They did a great job, and they don't get enough credit. I agree with at @I_Barnabas and at Return Shadows. Shout out to them. Shout out to John Philip Betancourt and at I_Barnabas. Those two just don't get enough credit for their performances in that movie, and they were really, really good in that movie. Those two are watchable in that movie. Is Johnny Depp's performance of Barnabas Collins good? It's not god awful, is what I'll say. It's it's almost like he was trying to be Fred's Barnabas, but then he was also trying to find his own within the course of the movie. And you that comes across in so many ways throughout that movie when you go watch it. But the best to me, the best Barnabas Collins was Fred. Now, who was really their own Barnabas Collins, who was truly not Fred's, who was really their own, was Ben Cross. Ben Cross did a hell of a Barnabas Collins in the 90s revival. I forget the guy who they had in the '04 unaired pilot. Would I, just by one episode, would I say he was Barnabas? Was he Jonathan Frid's Barnabas? I don't know. I mean, I went back and watched that so many times now to try to sort of piece together what he was trying to be. It's so hard to judge on one episode. And what I'll say is, was he trying to be Frid's Barnabas? I would dare say it was more like he was trying to be Ben Cross's Barnabas more than Frid's. If anything else, I'm not saying that he was for sure. That, again, this is my opinion, and I want to stress that repeatedly. But that this is my opinion. So I more feel he was trying to be Ben Cross's Barnabas more so than Fred's. I mean, so that's my view of it. Do I feel they should have canoned one of these movies? Um, I do feel one should have at least been canon, but if you're gonna canon it, write it as a canon, not write it as its own thing. So I wouldn't have minded if they would have canoned one of the movies and wrote it as such, but I'm not tore up about it either. I'm not really one way or the other about this. It's just, it is what it is. These movies just aren't canoned with the series, and they're their own versions of events. And that's really what it is with Dark Shadows. Dark Shadows, the movies, all three movies are their own. Is Night of Dark Shadows a good movie? I give it an 8. And people might say, well, it's not really the best because they don't, there's things that was taken out of it. I understand that. I do. And will they ever go back and like add the stuff in that Dan had to take out? I don't know. That would be nice, as many people have mentioned to me over the time. But again, these movies, they are what they are. They're just not canon work into the series, and they're their own movies. Do you have to like them? No. Do you have to hate them? No. I give House of Dark Shadows a 7. I give Night of Dark Shadows an 8. I do enjoy Night of Dark Shadows. Night of Dark Shadows is its own movie. I've again, it's wicked as hell, really too. 2012's gets a 5. And you guys know why. I'm not going to beat it to death. I do feel there's good moments in that movie. I do feel, like I said, Michelle Pfeiffer and Eva Green's performance is really good. Um, Bella Heathcote, I don't feel they made her enough of a focus in this movie. There's moments in this movie where she just disappears and you don't see her for a good bit of time. And I'm not the only one that's made that point. Again, shout out to John Philip Betancourt. Shout out to at @I_Barnabas. They've made those points several times. And they're right. I mean, Bella Heathcote's character just Maggie Evans, and that's who she is, even though she calls herself Victoria Winters. Literally, just the last 10 minutes of the film is just gone. Like, where'd she go? But that's the end of my video. I hope you guys enjoyed this. I know this is like really, really long. I'm not expecting a ton of views on this, but give me you guys' thoughts on the 3 movies. What were your thoughts about them? Like, share, comment, subscribe, and I see you soon.